In 1984, writer Jean Van Ham and artist William Vance created the comic series 13, released as a serial in the Belgian magazine Spirou. It proved to be very popular and has regularly received new episodes ever since. In 2002, Ubisoft announced the video game 13, an adaptation of the comics that promised to reach limits of interactive gameplay never experienced before. Sales of the game were apparently lackluster, and in a statement that in hindsight is pretty distressing, then and still current Ubisoft CEO and abuse enabler Yves Guillemot said that the company learned that trying new things was simply too risky in a market dominated by established brands. That statement was made in a sales report about record high profits, by the way. Anyway, the point is that even though the game only covered roughly a third of the comic material at the time, there were no plans for a sequel. But after 16 years, the rights somehow ended up at game publisher Microids, who announced a remake of the game developed by Playmagic. Its release got delayed by 1 year and then came out in late 2020, simply named 13. And that's how we ended up with two different games, both called 13. So join me as I play through both of these 13s. I'll highlight what makes each one notable and then determine which deserves to keep its name and which one is getting a new title. Let's find out which one comes out on top, as there can be only one 13. XIII is a linear shooter with some stealth elements. The game opens with the player character washing ashore on Brighton Beach, suffering from bullet wounds and total amnesia. The only clues to your identity are a key on your person and a tattoo on your collarbone, the Roman numeral 13. After being attacked by armed men, you set out to discover your true identity, and in the process, you learn that you are a secret agent on a mission to infiltrate a shadowy group called the Clan of 20, who are enacting a sinister plan to overthrow the US government. The most obvious thing to talk about in this game is the visual style. While it certainly wasn't the first game to go for a cel-shaded look, it still got quite a distinctive aesthetic to it. Even the main menu and all of the cutscenes are given a comic book style makeover. Explosions say "Baoom!" and instead of traditional screen shake, the game jostles the borders of your screen around as if it were a comic panel, which is honestly a really great touch, particularly because it sells the effect without disrupting your view and your aim the way that screen shake usually does. More games should do this. The game also has picture-in-picture pop-ups to inject certain moments or interactions with some extra flavor, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of the 3 frames that show up every time you get a headshot, though they could be smaller. It's not just cosmetic though. The comic book presentation also comes into play when you want to look at camera feeds, and sometimes those pop-ups will warn you about enemies that are around corners or at different elevations, which is particularly helpful in the stealth sections. Speaking of which, while you're sneaking, you can see enemy positions as they move around by looking for the words tap 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 that pop up in 3D space to signify their footsteps. And you always know when you've killed someone because a big red "No" always appears near their head. By going for a stylized look, I think the game is graphically pretty timeless. Honestly, I think it looks great. Personally, I'm always going to prefer a game with a memorable aesthetic, any memorable aesthetic, over one with yet another drab photorealistic look. I mean, we have the technology to make games look pretty much any kind of way we want, so surely trying to make them look like real life is the single most boring option. Equating good graphics with realism is like looking at The Scream and concluding that Munch sucks at painting because people don't actually look like that. Anyway, 13's graphics aren't quite 100%, more like 95%, maybe more. For one thing, some of the textures are noticeably low resolution, and while the general blockiness of the models actually suits the aesthetic pretty well, I feel like the heads on the characters at least could use a few more polygons. Also, the thick black edge lines aren't perfect, and there's some bad pop-in in this one spot of this one level. And I noticed some of the masking in the cutscenes is kind of off. Though, to be fair, this game came out in 2003, meaning that it was designed with CRT monitors in mind, and the max resolution is normally 640 by 480. And under those conditions, all of my gripes with the graphics would be basically impossible to even notice, so I can't really fault the devs. As I mentioned already, this game has some stealth mechanics, but they're honestly pretty half-assed. Generally speaking, enemies notice you very quickly, very far away, and even sometimes when you're behind them, and once you've been spotted, you're better off just gunning people down instead of trying to disengage and resume stealth. The game even has special interactions for stealth takedowns and hostage taking, But even when I snuck up behind enemies, they'd usually detect me before I could pull either of those moves off. The only stealth takedown I ever managed to do was the tutorial one, and the only hostages I ever took were scripted events. Oh yeah, there's another modern graphical issue. The hostages noticeably clip with the near plane of the camera, but under the circumstances that the devs expected, you would never see this, so... Unfortunately, there are a few sections where stealth is strictly required, and as is typical of forced stealth sections in games, these all suck. Compounding the pain is the fact that the game does not allow you to save arbitrarily, so you're reliant on the fairly infrequent checkpoints. For me, this meant that a lot of the stealth sections were pretty taxing, as I had to redo the same minutes-long stretches over and over, as the punishingly perceptive AI gave me almost no breathing room. At one point I realized I was actually making it a lot harder for myself. The game provides several ways to take out enemies silently, like one-off improvised weapons, throwing knives, a silenced pistol, crossbows, but it turns out that these are largely aesthetic choices. Even during stealth sections, it was generally fine to just run and gun. These are not the most perceptive guards of all time. But then there are some levels where you can't have the alarm go off, and you can't kill anyone, but you're still required to knock them out using those improvised weapons, or your fists, because of how the levels are laid out. One of the late game levels in particular was absolutely excruciating for me. It took me over half an hour just to get through it. Okay, in fairness, partly that was because I got, distracted. But mostly it was because the checkpoints were placed really far apart from each other, and those long stretches were absolutely full of opportunities to get spotted and have to retry. On top of that, some of the rules were not immediately clear to me. Like cameras. I thought the cameras were just cosmetic because I hadn't been caught by them before, but no. You have to take the camera guy out, and it just so happens that I had taken the camera guy out for the previous cameras, but not these cameras. Time to do it all over again. And sure, having to take out the camera guy makes sense, but up to that point, it hasn't been a mechanic, so I wasn't expecting it. Also, once you get near the end, new soldiers spawn, and if they spot any of the unconscious bodies that you've been forced to leave around, they'll pull the alarm, and now you have to retry again. The game does warn you about this. It only reminds you to hide the bodies if more enemies will spawn, but you have no way of knowing when those guards will spawn, where they'll spawn, or where their patrols will take them. So it's hard to know whether a given spot is actually a safe place to hide bodies or not. Most of the game though, you'll just be running room to room, mowing down everybody along the way. I kept getting the impression that the game's levels were largely designed with some degree of stealth in mind, which struck me as kind of bizarre given how the AI is not really built for it. But I kept noticing little nooks and crannies you could hide in, only some of which had extra loot. The game does break up the action and keep it from feeling monotonous with some memorable arenas, and the environments are generally pretty good. A few of the levels take place in fairly samey, bland interiors, but most of the time it puts you somewhere memorable and distinctive. For example, the frozen wilderness feels pretty huge, even if it isn't really, and that contrasts nicely with the later canyon area, which feels hectic and claustrophobic. And even several of the interiors have distinct atmospheres. One thing the game is really great at doing is setting up these moments where you really feel like you're playing as a schlocky comic book super spy action hero. The first time you take a hostage and back away from the guards feels great, and the game gives you a grappling hook right away and makes pretty good use of it throughout the entire story. Unfortunately, playing the game is never a completely smooth experience. There are tons of little hiccups that you'll run into constantly while playing. For one thing, a lot of your interactions are just kind of clunky. For example, once you start reloading, you're fully committed to it. Particularly with automatic weapons, this meant I had to suppress the urge to switch to a different weapon once the automatic reload starts, because I'd still be forced to sit through the reload, and then the game would swap to the other gun, so I'd have to sit through the weapon swapping animation too. It's just kind of awkward. Speaking of which, you reload the shotgun all at once. That's not really a bad thing. If anything, I'm just kind of surprised by how conditioned I am to expect to reload one shell at a time. The game has an inventory system that's separate from your weapons, which wasn't really uncommon back in the day for shooters. The inventory contains the medkits that you pick up in the levels, and those can be easily used with a hotkey, so you don't really have to fiddle with your inventory to get to them. But this honestly had me questioning why the medkits even exist, at least the way that they currently do. There's no downside or penalty to using them, except that you can waste excess healing, meaning that the game wants you to push your health to the brink before you use one. But that isn't really a problem because your health flashes red when it gets to a low number, so you just wait for that to happen and then you press the medkit button and then you're good. It's just an extra bit of tedium, frankly. I almost feel like it'd be better if medkits were just instantly added to your health and your health didn't have a max limit anymore. For all practical purposes, that's exactly how they do work, except you have to press the button yourself when the health gets low. But it doesn't really feel like it's adding anything to the gameplay by doing that. Most of your inventory items are keys and key cards, but thankfully you don't have to scroll through your inventory to use those either. Instead, interacting with the locked doors will pull them out automatically, so that's nice. The one thing that does require scrolling through your inventory though is that grappling hook, which is just annoying. Particularly because this means that you can't ascend or descend on the hook with a gun out, and there are definitely a few points in the game where that would have been nice. Really, the grappling hook in general is just not your friend. Usually it works perfectly fine, but then it can also be kind of finicky at other times. There are a few times when it just disconnected me and I wasn't entirely sure why. So when it works, it's great, but when it doesn't, it's just kind of awkward. Anytime the game offered an alternate route that would let me avoid using the hook, I took it. Another bizarre choice is the unlockable skills. As you progress through the story, you can unlock new skills like dual wielding and quieter movement. And normally I'd feel pretty ambivalent about this, but a lot of the skills are easily missed. You have to find them in blue booklets hidden throughout the game. I didn't even realize that was a thing until I had almost finished the game. And to my surprise, I had actually gotten all of them except for dual wielding, which is arguably the most impactful skill in the game. On top of that, there's no mission select, not without cheating anyway. Once you finish the story, your only option is a full restart. I'm not doing that for dual wielding. One of those unlocks is the sniper skill. See, as was fairly typical at the time, most of the guns in this game have an alternate fire. The assault rifle's alt fire shoots the underbarrel grenade, you can fan the hammer with the revolver, you can bash people with the shotgun, stuff like that. This helps to give each gun a more unique identity and purpose. The sniper rifle and crossbows are equipped with scopes, so their alt fire lets you zoom in for long range kills. Normally, the scope sways all over the damn place. Some people might find this annoying, but personally I think it kind of adds to the gameplay, especially because enemies tend to not do any big, surprising movements anyway. It gives me something to do while I'm zoomed in, and adds some kind of give and take with the scopes. I'm into it. But if you get the marksman skill some ways into the game, the scope stops swaying. Isn't that kind of backwards? Like, surely as the player becomes more comfortable with a game, it should be adding more mechanics, not removing them, right? Now, I was praising the environments earlier, but a lot of the level design is pretty obscure. There were a few points where it wasn't immediately clear to me where I was supposed to be going, and I had to walk around in circles for a while trying to figure things out. Sometimes the way forward was really not obvious, like how here at the docks you're not supposed to go up to the walkways where enemies were coming from, but rather you're supposed to walk along this narrow ledge that's tucked away behind a bunch of boxes. Other times it was just a matter of looking around with the grappling hook out to see if there were any grapple points that I had to use. Those grapple points aren't really obvious unless you take the grappling hook out, and it's not that bad, but definitely a bit unintuitive. Or okay, just look at this. Where the hell are you supposed to go here? The gate? Nope. The other gate? Nope. Any grapple points I'm missing? No. Something to do with the van? Oh, of course. This specific patch of hedge is destructible. How silly of me not to know that. It really doesn't help that this game is absolutely filled with doors that cannot be opened, and there's literally no way of distinguishing without walking up and trying every single door. Look at this. Can't open, can't open, can't open, can. I can open these double doors right here, but just a few steps down the hall there are some double doors that I can't open. But then I can open these doors through here and end up on the other side of those unopenable double doors anyway. What's the point? The levels are all pretty linear, but like I said, there are plenty of little extra areas to explore. And normally I'd say that's a good thing, but when your required path is more obscure than any of the secrets, that's pretty bad. Here, I hopped into a small pool because I thought there would be a secret in it, but it turns out that you're just supposed to do this. It's the only way to progress through the level. Not obvious. In one level, after crawling through some vents, not because it made any sense to, just because it was the only possible way forward, I overhear a scrawny evil doctor killing one of his patients. Now, by this point, I've spent roughly 2 hours gunning down baddies ranging from hired thugs to highly trained special forces, and even the ones in armor go down pretty quick. See, the revolver one-shots anybody as long as I get a headshot. It's super satisfying. So naturally, when I hop down to fight that doctor and I blast him in the head with a revolver, it does, what, maybe 5% of his health? Yeah, you just have to kind of sit there and shoot him. It's not a particularly difficult fight. Actually, it's not that hard to do it without taking damage at all, but it takes a while. This is a solid 30 seconds of just clicking on a guy over and over. Now, that's not a huge amount of time in the grand scheme of things, but this isn't exactly fun or engaging gameplay. Unfortunately, the Doctor is not alone. The game has several boss fights just like him, only the rest have hit-scan guns. One level is just 2 such boss fights back to back, and not a whole lot of medkits, so it's easy to just kind of die, and there isn't a whole lot that you can do about it. Now, one potential boss thankfully blows his own brains out instead of fighting you. He was my favorite one in the game. I wish more racist coup attempters took this route. He's shortly followed by my least favorite boss, who is also the final boss of the whole game. Okay, the presentation here actually kicks ass. He scurries around like a rat, hiding behind these massive missiles that I only just halted the launch of. And while we're dueling, my accomplice Jones is fighting off goons up top, and their bodies fall down into the arena with extra supplies for me to pick up. So the aesthetics here are brilliant, but the duel itself is just me clicking on a guy. It's not really that interesting to play. One last snag is the player character himself. Overall, I'd say the voice acting in this game is pretty good, but 13 himself constantly sounds like he just woke up and doesn't care about anything.
I've fallen into my own trap.
At first, I thought this was to signify how dazed and disoriented he is, because he has total amnesia.
Well then, who am I?
But it stays at that level throughout the entire game.
This is not good.
Yeah, that's him realizing he's about to die. The voice actor is David Duchovny, who is a good actor, so this really just goes to show you how acting in front of a camera and acting behind a microphone are 2 completely different skill sets.
Number 1, I was so close.
So what to make of 13? I know I sat here and just complained about it for 10 minutes, but the reality is that everything I said was overall kind of minor. Like, most of the game is pretty great. It's just that there are also constant but minor nuisances that go along with it. Sure, beyond the initial intrigue, the story is kind of whatever, the gunplay doesn't really feel like anything special, though it's still not bad, and the game is peppered with tedious stealth sections and boss fights. But it does such a good job of making me feel like a comic book action hero that it's hard for me to not enjoy it overall. XIII is a linear shooter with some stealth gameplay. It has the exact same story as the original. Actually, it has almost the exact same everything as the original. See, unlike every other game on this show so far, this 13 is an honest-to-goodness remake of the original. Not a reboot, not a reimagining. Everything that's in this game has been recreated from the original. Remember these doors? They're exactly the same here. For some reason. To be honest, I'm not really sure why they wanted to do it this way. I would think that if you're already planning on remaking everything, it wouldn't be that hard to just make something else. I'd much prefer a reboot. I mean, if I wanted to play a game that was exactly like the original 13, well, I could just play the original 13. So surely the more different, the better, right? If nothing else, I guess it simplifies this review in that I can just talk about what's different between the original and the remake, because it's kind of a short list. But before I get into that, I should share a little more of this game's history. When the remake first released, its reviews were absolutely terrible, criticizing its bugginess, inept AI, and its art style. It was so bad, actually, that Microids, the publisher, released a public apology. Let's see here. We hear you loud and clear. It doesn't meet our quality standards. The pandemic impacted development. Working from home caused delays. We're working hard to fix it. We're reviewing all your feedback. We'll reveal a detailed roadmap soon. Hey, I got a corporate PR bingo. I don't really know who these kinds of statements are for. Shareholders, I guess. Now, this is anecdotal, but it seems to me that the general response when games come out full of bugs is to just kind of assume that the people who made it are bad at game development, but that's really not the case. Usually, it's the people who didn't make the game who are bad at their jobs, managers and CEOs and such. In the case of the 13 remake, former employees at PlayMagic have made it pretty clear that the company's CEO, Giuseppe Cruliano, is the number one guy to blame. I think Cruliano is going for Game Dev CEO of the Year or something. Before working on the 13 remake, PlayMagic was hired by 4A Games to make a VR adaptation of one of their games. According to the former employees, Cruliano just straight up lied to 4A Games about what PlayMagic would be able to deliver, and then he basically forced everyone to work constant overtime because if the team didn't make those milestones, then they just didn't get paid at all. And then instead of actual overtime pay, the company just gave a one-time bonus that was not representative of the hours that people were actually working, which reportedly was consistently over 100 hours a week, month after month. Former employees say that they barely saw their friends and family at all during that time. On top of that, they report that they were often not even paid on time. Now, Cruliano claims that the late paychecks were due to clients not paying up, and when asked to comment on the crunch, he said, "If a team doesn't deliver or fails a milestone, there are consequences." Okay. After the VR project crashed and burned, Cruliano pivoted to a remaster of 13. Originally, he just wanted to rip the assets out of the original game and slap them onto a new engine. Not exactly a worthwhile goal, in my opinion, but, an achievable one. But then the team determined that retrieving the assets from the original game wasn't really feasible, so the scope of the project expanded to an entire remake. And get this, the PlayMagic team didn't even have a character animator at the time. They just didn't have one. Now, they hired some, but only halfway into development. Cruliano claims that he had difficulty hiring people because he required employees to move to Malta. And of course, the obvious solution there is to just not require people to move to Malta, not least because game dev is particularly well suited to remote work, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who cares about that. Anyway, it turns out that the real reason he had difficulty hiring animators is because he was blacklisted by recruitment agencies for previously having used them and not paying them. Nice. Soon it became clear that the 13 remake just wasn't going to be finished in time for its announced release date, resulting in that aforementioned 1-year delay. So naturally, PlayMagic took on another project porting a game for Aspyr. Now, the already understaffed team was working on 2 major projects at the same time. The Aspyr project went on for about 6 months before Aspyr decided that PlayMagic wasn't delivering and that they would just do it themselves. And through it all, PlayMagic never had a single QA employee. Never. They just expected programmers to test their own code, and that was it. Brilliant. At long last, 13 was released to horrible reviews, and over a quarter of PlayMagic's developers left the company. Reportedly, Cruliano likes telling the people on his team that anybody who leaves is just a quitter. Classy. When former employees find work at other companies, Cruliano then goes out of his way to harass them, getting in touch with their new employers to convince them that they're incompetent. When asked about this, Cruliano described his disgruntled ex-employees as just a bunch of crybabies, saying, because they didn't get a promotion, because they didn't get their salary, everything was personal. So yeah, it's easy to bash the remake for being a buggy mess, but the reality is that its bugginess is the direct result of a lot of hardworking and passionate people being forced to suffer. I think it's worth bearing that in mind. Bugginess is a disservice to a game's players, but more often than not, it's also an indication of many, many disservices to the game's developers, too. Anyway, that roadmap that Microids promised never materialized. Shocking, I know. Instead, over a year and a half later, Microids revealed that they were no longer working with PlayMagic and had hired a new developer, Tower 5, to, in their words, rework the entire game from art direction to the AI. Jeez. Now, you might be tempted to call these 2 different 13s, the remake and the remade remake. I mean, I was tempted to. But that's really not accurate. The Tower 5 rework of the remake really is just an update. Disregarding bug fixes, the mechanical differences before and after that rework are pretty minimal. The remake originally had limitations on how many weapons you could carry at a time, which is not how the original game worked, and it doesn't really make sense with the gameplay. The only reason you drop a weapon is if you're running out of the ammo for it, but that's also a reason to just switch off of that weapon even if there isn't a weapon limit. So there's no interesting impact on the gameplay, just kind of a tedious one. So that weapon limit was removed with the rework, and that's it. That's the only major mechanical change. Everything else is either minor or cosmetic. Now, like I said, the remake was initially heavily criticized for its art style, and looking at it, I'd have to agree. The original game's style is pretty timeless. All it really needs in order to look modern is higher resolution textures and a few more polygons here and there. The new game looks, well, it looks like Fortnite. This is a trend that I've noticed generally with, for lack of better words, simplified art styles. Like, if you just search for low poly art, there's a definite theme of exaggerated proportions and a sort of soft, cutesy look. Now, I'm not saying that that's like an inherently bad aesthetic, not at all, but I feel like there are so many more options for art with a small number of polygons. Even something like, say, Warcraft 3, which is decidedly going for an exaggerated and stylized low poly look, still isn't really soft or cutesy. I wouldn't necessarily say that the 13 remake was going for that soft and cutesy look either, but it definitely moved a bit in that direction compared to the original game. And obviously these models aren't low polygon, but it's sort of a higher polygon version of that same trend. The rework didn't include any changes to those models, but it did alter a bunch of the lighting and change some of the textures. For what it's worth, I don't really like the character models, like, at all, and the shadows on their faces are just plain ugly, but I think all of the item models in the game are slam dunks. The guns in particular are all great. The rework also slathered the entire game with a shader that draws thick black lines along edges, and I kind of hate it. Here's what I think is going on. Let's say you want your computer to render a 3D box. Normally, it would draw all of the faces, but not just the 6 outer faces, also the 6 inside faces. Now for most models, you'll never see those back faces anyway, so most 3D renderers will not even draw them, sparing your graphics card some pointless work. If you've played games for long enough, you probably already knew that, because if you ever clip your camera into objects, you end up seeing right through them instead of seeing the inside of them. Well, I think instead of culling the back faces, the original game actually draws them, but slightly large and completely black, which is how it achieves the outlines. Supporting this theory is the hostages from earlier. The camera clips through them, but instead of seeing through them, you just see blackness. This is a pretty simple solution, and it results in a pretty consistent look. It also means that the lines are actually placed in the 3D world, so they distort with perspective, and they're altered by all of the same visual effects being applied to the model that they're attached to, because the lines are literally part of that model. In the rework of the remake, it now seems like it's just a screen space shader that's being applied after the world gets drawn. It scans the screen for significant differences in depth and slaps the black lines down accordingly. Now, there's a really big issue with that, and it's basically the greatest bane of anyone who's worked with 3D graphics, but I'll get to that in a second. First, I want to point out some of the other issues with 13's implementation, like how it flickers a lot. I think part of the issue here is that the lines are actually based on 2 constantly changing parameters, relative differences in depth and distance to the camera. This makes the lines inherently volatile, and I personally found it kind of distracting. It also makes it really hard to focus on anything or make out what you're looking at a glance. There were several points in the game where it was useful to be able to quickly scan your surroundings for any enemies, but the lines make it kind of hard to do that. On top of that, either the line shader is a temporal effect itself, or it's dramatically affected by the temporal anti-aliasing, which unfortunately can't be disabled. For those of you who don't know, temporal effects use previous frames to inform what they should draw to the current frame. I personally see that as very obviously conceptually flawed. See, here's the thing about frames. They change. Sometimes they change a lot. So surely using information from previous frames is going to constantly introduce distracting artifacts, right? And yeah, it does. Those artifacts are called ghosts. See, look there. You can see those faint duplicates of Jones trailing behind her. That's ghosting. It sucks. It just gives the whole game a vaguely fuzzy feeling. And like I said, the thick black lines jitter. Constantly. In fact, they jitter while the game is paused, so it's not subtle camera movements causing it. It's a temporal artifact. On top of that, the lines behave differently based on distance, and it's kind of obvious. Just look at the floor here. Oh, that is bad. Also, they didn't quite get their order of operations correct. There are several flashback sequences throughout the game as you piece together some of your memories, and whenever entering or exiting those flashbacks, your vision starts to distort. But the lines don't get distorted with the 3D world. Yuck. But the biggest problem with these lines is what I had alluded to earlier, the great nemesis of 3D artists everywhere: transparency. The lines look so bad through transparency because they aren't affected by it. And you might think that this is just an unfair angle, but no, not only are those light beams pretty common, but there are several points in the game where you are obliged to do absolutely nothing except look through windows. And it looks bad. So that's what changed in the rework. But what about differences between the remake and the original game? Well, sticking with visuals, the cutscenes have received a pretty significant downgrade. The original game's cutscenes were going for a stylish, moving comic look, whereas this game's cutscenes are a lot more traditional. You still get some nods to its comic book origins, but they feel almost pointless. It's not used for emphasis or to highlight specific details, it's just there to be there. And when they do the whole pull away from the comic panel thing, it looks more like a pile of photographs than an actual comic. And the intro cutscene is just some nondescript FBI guy watching the original game's intro cutscene on a projector. Why? And there's also at least one cutscene that's just completely missing, dropping you into the next mission with absolutely no context or motivation for what you're doing. Also, all of the cutscenes are pre-rendered, which isn't a problem at all. That was true of the original game too. But they weren't re-rendered for the reworked graphics. And on top of that, there are several pretty noticeable lighting glitches. One of the major technological innovations since the original 13's release is, of course, ragdolls. And ragdolls make really any game better, but at the same time, I think there's some artistry that's missing too. The original game only has a limited number of death animations, but they're all good. Particularly when you got headshots, the fact that they'd stay upright for a moment before dropping just felt good. You don't get that in the new game. More importantly, there are several spots in the original game where an enemy standing on a ledge is scripted to dramatically fall off when you kill them, which always looked super cool. But aside from a couple of early examples, those are just absent from the remake, and even the few that are present simply don't look as good. Similarly, the headshot pop-ups are still here, but they're not nearly as fun. In the original game, the 3 frames that pop up have a very small amount of movement, but even if they didn't, they'd still give a really good sense of the person actually getting shot in the head, almost like a before, during, and after of the impact. In the remake, it's just the same picture 3 times, slightly more zoomed in. You completely lose that sense of impact. As for the other picture-in-picture comic panes, they don't use them nearly as often as the original game did. They are almost never used to warn you about incoming threats, which doesn't matter a whole lot for this game, but it would be nice for the forced stealth sections. Also, this game doesn't recreate the original's screen shake effect. Instead, it's just the typical kind of screen shake as in every other game, only it's such a minuscule amount that it's barely even noticeable. The level layouts very closely imitate the original game's levels, though the environments in general are way nicer to look at. The checkpoints are much more densely placed throughout the levels, and there are also a few minor changes to the layouts here and there. And this game is much more upfront with you about how loud the stealth sections can be. One of the earliest in the game is front-loaded with so many enemies that genuine sneaking isn't really an option. Or at least not an obvious option. I'd say almost all of the changes that I noticed were positive, except that now the frozen wilderness feels like a fairly constricted hallway. And the original game is pretty open and felt vast, like a place that your character could feasibly get lost in, which, he has. Although that's the cutscene that's missing from the remake, so I guess the player doesn't even know that they're supposed to be lost. Also, the canyon has an extremely abrasive look. The bright salmon orange color is kind of overwhelming, and particularly with the harsh black lines, it makes for kind of an assault on the eyes. Unlike every other environment, I'd say it looked better, or at least less painful, before the rework. As for mechanical differences from the original, the inventory system has been completely removed in favor of contextual interactions, which I'm entirely in favor of. Medkits now take a second to use, and it isn't much, but it is enough to make using them an actual strategic choice. And now that the grappling hook is separate from your equipment, you can shoot while ascending or descending, which is great, although it seems that the game is programmed to not let you swing while ascending or descending, which is much worse. Probably the two most significant changes to the gameplay are the introduction of aiming down sights and sprinting. I can't say I'm really a fan. I know these are kind of ubiquitous in shooters these days, but they weren't present in the original game, and I didn't feel their absence at all. I don't think it even really occurred to me to try aiming down the sights in the original. The reality is that aiming down sights is just kind of a pointless mechanic in the vast majority of shooters. Like, it makes your gun more accurate, and that's it. There's no reason to not just aim down sights every time you shoot, so why bother having it as a mechanic at all? Why not just make the guns that accurate all the time? It's just a pointless extra step for the player to take. In a way, it's worse than just pointless because there are significant cosmetic repercussions. Personally, as someone who holsters their gun whenever games let me, I think having your gun take up most of your vision looks kind of awful. I guess you could say that having to aim down sights is more realistic, but I wouldn't say that more realistic is an objective improvement for video games. And there are far more unrealistic things in most shooters that have aim down sights, like magazines that magically refill with all of your spare bullets. I feel similarly about sprinting. The original game didn't have sprinting because you were always running. You had to press a button to specifically walk. Now, I think ADS and sprinting have their place. I've played several games that force players to constantly make trade-offs between mobility, preparation, and weapon accuracy, but for the vast majority of shooters with ADS and sprinting, those trade-offs are only nominal. Anyway, I wouldn't say that sprinting necessarily detracts from 13, but aiming down sights definitely does. For one thing, I think it's just kind of awkward. I oftentimes decided to just not use it and went with the spray and pray tactic and enjoyed that a lot more. Ironically, I felt that the original game rewarded headshots way more than this one does, and I was trying a lot harder to get them then. In the remake, headshots aren't nearly as important. Look, the revolver one-shots people with or without the headshot, and I honestly feel like ADS actually made it harder for me to go for the head. Another part of the problem is that aiming down the sights just doesn't suit the aesthetic. How many times does James Bond use his sights? Now, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about James Bond, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess never? I mean, except for the sniper rifles, but you do use the scopes in 13, so... Plus, with those scopes, you're also sacrificing your peripheral vision and having to deal with the scope sway. You know, actual game mechanics. Speaking of which, another big change from the original to the remake is those skills. You just start with all of them, no unlocks necessary. I approve. I mean, I didn't necessarily dislike the skills of the original game, I just didn't like how it was easy to unintentionally miss them. But getting them all from the get-go is fine too. It meant that I could dual wield this time around at least. The guns all behave basically the same way that they did in the original, other than the addition of aiming down sights. One set of changes that I'd say is just a total success is the weapon audio. The guns all sound fantastic. The original game's guns don't sound bad or anything, but the remakes are a lot more satisfying. The reloading animations have a lot more care put into them too. The original games were pretty minimal and largely involved just lowering the gun off screen. Now for the time, that's more or less what you would expect, and to be honest, I was just impressed by the pistol slide locking open when the magazine was emptied. Anyway, the remake gets full-blown reloading animations, and I'd even say that this game's dual-wielding reloads are some of the best that I've ever seen. You can also interrupt your reloading by switching to a different weapon, and you reload the shotgun one shell at a time now. But there is still some awkwardness with the reloads. If you start holding down the fire button too early, the reload will finish and you just won't shoot until you release and hold fire again. Now that's a small thing, but the window for that is larger than you might think, and it's pretty awkward in fights. The last big difference is the objective marker. I feel kind of mixed about it. On the one hand, the original 13 had its fair share of moments where it was really unclear what you're supposed to do to progress. The remake actually already cleaned up a lot of that with those level layout changes, like how the way forward here is much more clear, but then they also slapped an objective marker on it. I really don't mind a bit of looking around and feeling my way through a level. It only gets annoying when I start to feel truly stumped. Honestly, I'd say this would be almost perfect if the game just waited until enough time has passed for the player to figure it out on their own. Yeah, like that. But this was the one place where I felt that time was calibrated correctly. Throughout the entire rest of the game, it just slaps down an objective marker as soon as you enter a new area. The original game makes you feel like you're infiltrating deep into hostile territory. The remake makes you feel like you're walking from one marker to another. Adding insult to injury, the game even features a button to reveal the objective marker prematurely. At that point, just make players use the button. Don't put it on a timer at all. Then, this would be perfect. Oh well. The bottom line is that this game really doesn't trust you as a player. At one point in the game, before holding out against waves of enemies in a wintry cabin, you trigger a flashback in which the owner of the cabin tells you about a weapon that she keeps hidden there.
I keep a weapon hidden in here, just in case.
That happens in the original too. But in the remake, they added a beat after the flashback where she points to the weapon, just in case you missed it. Even though I wouldn't really call that flashback particularly subtle. But then there are other times where the remake basically forces you to use the objective marker. Like here, in the original game, after defeating the evil doctor, you look at this painting and it triggers a flashback. When that flashback is done, the painting is moved aside to reveal a safe, which contains the key that you need to progress. And while there isn't really a reason to think that looking at the painting would progress the game, his office does stand out against the rest of the room, so it definitely draws your attention, and that's good enough. In the remake, it's all the same, except that after the flashback ends, the painting is still in place. I was really confused about what to do, and I was worried for a moment that the game was bugged or something. But then the objective marker popped up. Oh, silly me. I was supposed to come interact with specifically this book, which moves the painting aside. How are you supposed to know that? I didn't get that, and I even knew that the painting was meant to move aside to reveal a safe. I mean, come on, the Doctor isn't even number 2 of the conspirators. He's number 20. What the heck? Speaking of the Doctor, the boss fights are all still here, but they've been changed a little. They have a lot less health, and they can also be stunned. I don't actually know what the conditions for stunning them are exactly. They could be headshots or certain health thresholds. I don't know. The bosses are all kind of a joke, but I honestly couldn't tell you if I prefer them this way or not. So what to make of 13? As a game so deeply imitative of the original, it's kind of hard to know what the point of it is. I mean, other than cynically trying to cash in on the diehard fans of a 17-year-old game. But at the same time, while I was playing through the original game, I often found myself wishing that it had a more modern successor. Make the gunplay a little more fun, flesh out the stealth mechanics, and sand down all those rough edges. The remake did polish it up a bit, removing almost all of the little but constant nuisances of the original, but it didn't really make a new game. And for what it's worth, the game is still kind of buggy. I managed to crawl underneath the floor at one point, the reload sounds for the shotgun almost never worked correctly. The crossbow bolts that I shot into enemies would make whizzing sounds as I walked past their corpses, and corpses would occasionally just disappear. In my playthrough, one of the boss's corpses disappeared, and also a body that you're forced to carry turned invisible as soon as I picked it up. Compared to the original, every step forward in this game is also accompanied by a step back. Well, there we have it. We've seen what the 13s are offering. So, which is better? To be totally honest, I'm kind of having a hard time with this one. I think there are mainly 2 things that are making this difficult for me. The first is that these 2 games have a lot more similarities than differences. I mean, the second game is a complete recreation of the first, not a new game. This means that if you play one of them, you have almost no reason to play the other. I mean, you're not really going to get a new experience. And for all the positives that I could say about the original, it was also mired by constant annoyances, most of which are not present in the remake. The second reason I'm having difficulty is that at this point, I kind of just find shooters a bit boring. I've been playing shooters for over 20 years now, and in that time, further back even, the genre really hasn't changed, at all. When you get down to brass tacks, other than the half-baked stealth mechanics, there isn't a huge difference between the gameplay of the original 13 and, say, the original Doom from 10 years prior. Sure, the tech is very different, and 13 makes better use of its 3D world by having enemies who are far away and at different elevation, but the gameplay is largely the same. The 13 remake copies the original's gameplay and adds in all of the genre's innovations from the intervening 15 plus years, as in aiming down sights. That's it for new ideas in arcade shooters. I guess you also have some games where you have extra abilities in addition to the guns, but, well, older shooters had more imaginative weapons too. So the idea that you could do something in a shooter other than fire a conventional bullet is not new. I mean, I like shooters, but at a certain point the novelty of clicking on people is gonna wear off, right? For me, it seems like that certain point was about 20 years. Really, this is a good problem to have. We are so saturated with good to great shooters that we can be very choosy. So for a shooter to really get me excited to play it, it's gotta bring something unique to the table. Prey had absolutely mind-blowing technology that, even after almost 20 years, is still basically unique. Alien vs. Predator has great atmosphere and offers 3 distinct fantasies. Battlefront Online 2 has breathtaking environments and characterful abilities. I was talking about wanting a modern successor to 13. I would say Wolfenstein: The New Order fills those shoes pretty nicely. In addition to having basically perfect gunplay and stealth mechanics, it also has fantastic writing with a great story and great characters. So what's 13 got? Well, it's got aesthetics, or in the parlance of kids today, vibes. And the original's art style is way more in keeping with the comic book aesthetic than the remake's is, and actually there are quite a few things in the original that are absent from the remake. It's not just that missing cutscene, there's also a brief underwater fight that was removed. I didn't even particularly like it. I was disappointed that murky clouds of blood don't billow out of the bad guys after you harpoon them. But this is straight out of Thunderball. It's classic spy action stuff. Like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of those picture-in-picture pop-ups just aren't replicated, and there are also several lines of dialogue that are completely absent in the remake. My personal favorite was a two-parter. While infiltrating a conspirator's headquarters, you overhear one guard talking about his boat, and another guard getting annoyed with him.
Matthews and I spent the entire weekend sanding the ship's hull. Next Sunday we'll apply the anti-fouling.
Shut up with the boats.
Then, several minutes later, and much deeper into the compound, you can listen in on another pair of guards complaining about the guy who can't shut up about his boat.
Know who I'm talking about?
No.
You know. The one who always talks about his boat. He went on for 3 hours about caulking techniques the other day. That guy.
Oh, right. Isn't he on the outdoor team tonight?
It's a nice touch that adds a lot of character and color to the otherwise dime a dozen guards that you're mowing down without a second thought. In the remake, the guy still talks about his boat, but you don't get that follow-up conversation later. Or here's another one that I sorely missed. In the late game stealth section of Pain, you get this great dialogue where a soldier's getting a bit nervous about how he can't contact the upper levels of the base. You know, the levels that you've just swept through, knocking out everyone along the way.
Impossible to get through to the ground floor. Same for level 1. Nothing unusual to report from the command station. Galbraith is about to give the green light. Hello? Douglas here. I can't reach the reception area either. This is absurd. I want to know what's going on up there.
It just adds a little something to make your actions feel like they have tangible consequences, and that entire conversation just isn't in the remake. So yeah, given that the aesthetic is really the only selling point that 13 has for me, the clear winner is the original. Between the two, it's better at making you feel like a super spy action hero or feel like you're playing an interactive comic book. The remake may have better all-around gameplay, but only by a little, and the aesthetics are just a poor, flawed imitation of its source material. The original is 13. So what should the remake be called instead? Well, given its troubled development and drastic visual changes from the original, I'm feeling a bit inspired by the game's plot. It turns out that your character had undergone surgery to look like one of the conspirators, number 13. So this game should have been called 13 Under the Knife. But I can't help but feel that just 13 as a name sucks. For one thing, without any context, someone looking at the name might not immediately realize that it's Roman numerals. But even putting that aside, at the end of the day, the name is just a number. A number! I mean, I guess it's not alone. Oh, come on. It's almost impossible to find something specific about this game without also getting hits for Final Fantasy XIII or King of Fighters 13. And of course it is. I'm just Googling a number. Hey, what do you think of 13? 13 what? The name sucks. Even the James Bond franchise is generally called James Bond and not 007. Oh, hopefully I didn't just jinx that. Anyway, the original should have been called 13, The Conspiracy. Incidentally, that's what the made-for-TV movie is called, but that's okay. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for Prince of Persia. Yeah, so this might be the weirdest thing I found while researching for this series. It turns out that 8 years before founding PlayMagic, Giuseppe Cruliano had founded another game dev company called 12 Games, and around this time he also had his own record company called 12 Records. And 12 Records' top act? A duo called The Style, and one half of The Style is none other than Giuseppe Cruliano. It's kind of hard to spot him in the music videos, like he's only in this one for a brief flash. The videos tend to put most of their focus on the singer or the much younger women that they've hired to sort of writhe around them. Wait, there he is! Yeah, him! Wait, hold on! Come on, man, focus up, he's right there! Yeah, there! That's him! Oh, come on!